Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you to the museum for hosting me here. It's very exciting for me to be here. This is my first visit to Nantucket, and I can't think of a better reason to come here than to visit the Whaling Museum and to talk about whaling. Now, a lot of us think of whaling in the terms of whaling's history, and we think of whaling as something that has slipped into the past. Certainly in Nantucket, that happened early within the history of whaling, but we tend to think of it as something in the past of humanity, right? Humanity's past, something that we don't do anymore. What I'm going to be talking about with you this evening and reading a bit from my book has to do with whaling that is still happening today. This is contemporary whaling. People are hunting whales for food, perhaps even as we speak. There are two societies, two whaling cultures that I've been working with more than others for the past decade or so. That is St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the Caribbean and the Faroe Islands in the far North Atlantic. Now both of those are somewhat obscure countries, so I want to give a bit of a geographical lesson for you. The Faroe Islands are located about halfway between Iceland and Norway. They're a dependency of Denmark, so if you think of the United States relationship with, say, Guam or Puerto Rico, that's a pretty good analog for the Faroe Islands to Denmark. St. Vincent and the Grenadines are an independent country, an archipelago made up of several islands located in the southern Caribbean. If you don't know where St. Vincent and the Grenadines are, but you do know Barbados, they're in the same general neighborhood there. Grenada and St. Lucia are also neighboring islands. So that puts a little bit of geographical context. We've got a subarctic country in the north and a tropical country in the south. And what unites these two countries, perhaps among other things, is that they both hunt a variety of small cetacean species for food. And what do I mean by small cetaceans? Well, smaller than this fellow up here. This is a skeleton of a sperm whale, as I'm sure you all know. The small cetaceans that are hunted in the Faroe Islands and St. Vincent are all physically smaller than this, but they're also different in terms of their regulation and their protection. We know of the International Whaling Commission, which forbids the commercial take of sperm whales and all the baleen whales. The commission does not regulate the take of small cetaceans. So these hunting operations, these whaling operations that are going on now are legal because there's no international agreement that would ban them. Now, they're legal within the countries where they occur. You could not go offshore here in Nantucket, USA, and harpoon a whale, thank God. However, that's because there is an American law, a series of American laws against doing so. The Faroe Islands and St. Vincent and the Grenadines have not passed equivalent laws, and therefore whaling remains legal in those places. I started doing research first in the Faroe Islands in 2005. I was a graduate student. This was research that led to my PhD thesis and that I continued afterwards. After working in the Faroe Islands for a number of years, I brought on St. Vincent and the Grenadines as another field site. I wanted to make a comparison. I found that it was very interesting that these two countries that were so different in so many different ways were united in their use of the whale as food. They even prepare it in some of the same ways, which we'll get to a bit later. I started working in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 2008, and although I've stopped working actively in the Faroe Islands now, I continue to work in St. Vincent. I was there just a couple of months ago, and I expect to be going back for years to come. When you conduct research, you have to decide how close you're going to get to your subject. And this was something that was especially important for me, pursuing a subject as controversial and as problematic to many as whaling. I could go in as a disinterested observer. I could go in as an interviewer. I could go in as a participant. I chose to go in as a combination of all of these roles. When needed, I lent a hand to the whaling itself. When asked to, I consumed the whale meat and the blubber that was produced as food. When possible, I interviewed both whalers and anti-whaling activists. In spreading myself as thin as I did, I gave up any pretense of objectivity. I'm not sure that objectivity ever existed in the first place. Everybody comes into a situation with biases. Whether they acknowledge those biases or not, Your background, your history, your personality, your culture makes you who you are. And I entered into these whaling communities from my own background. I grew up in Tampa, Florida. I was on the beach as much as humanly possible. My first encounters with whales and dolphins were viewing them from the shore. I would see a dorsal fin, or 2 or 3 or 10, come up a few meters offshore, and I was transfixed, like any of you would have been. I loved seeing these animals alive. The first time I saw one killed was traumatic for me. I'm going to read a passage that I wrote after watching that dolphin killed. My use of the word dolphin here should indicate some taxonomic flexibility in the terms whaling, whales, and dolphins. The whalers in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the Faroe Islands pursue animals of the order Cetacea. That's where all of the whales and dolphins are located, and specifically within the family Delphinidae. So these are dolphins, even though some of them may have names like killer whale, pilot whale, melon-headed whale. They're dolphins, they're toothed, they resemble the dolphins that you may have seen at the beach from a boat, or if it's your experience with them at SeaWorld. They were not hunting large baleen whales. No. Is that better? They were not hunting large baleen whales. Rather, they were hunting small toothed cetaceans that we would consider dolphins. I'm going to read a passage, just a paragraph from the text, about my own involvement with whales and dolphins. And this, I acknowledge, may change the course of your acceptance of me as a speaker. I'm going to give a bit of a mea culpa here. In fact, my own hands are not clean. The participatory nature of the fieldwork that led to this book required that I be present to assist in the process of whaling in both locations. To one who equates whaling with murder, I was an accomplice. To the whalers themselves, I was merely an assistant. At best, a semi-inept sharer in the labor. At worst, a body in the way. In both field sites, more than once, I traveled back uncomfortably to my lodgings after whaling, dried blood and salt residue staining my skin, the smell of the butchery lingering around me, wafting from my clothes and from my hair. I never personally killed a whale, although at times I wanted to. Not for the macabre experience like some big game trophy hunter, but to put a suffering cetacean out of its misery, when the process of dying, coldly measured by my stopwatch during the time to death portion of my research, seemed to drag on forever. In the Faroe Islands, whaling is a community activity. If you've read Moby Dick, if you've even just made a circuit through the museum, you know of the standard American style of whaling. A whaleboat like the one behind me would be lowered from a mothership. Rowers would pursue the whale. A harpooner in the bow would thrust the harpoon into the whale. That gives you no indication of what happens in the Faroe Islands. It is a completely different style of whaling. In the Faroe Islands, whales are driven ashore. You've heard of or maybe even seen mass strandings of whales where they beach themselves on a coastline somewhere. The Faroese induce that. They cause a beaching to take place in order to take the whales as food. I'm going to read a section here that describes Faroese whaling. This was not the first time that I saw it, but it felt like it was the first time because I had a group of my students with me. And for all of my students, it was the first time they'd ever seen anything like this. This is one of the pleasures of my profession. I'm a professor. I take students out into the field with me, whether for research or for teaching purposes, and I get to see things through their eyes afresh. It keeps me young, it keeps me interested. I'm going to read this reflection that I have, which is part my own and part my students. As the boats approached, we heard hands slapping hulls, wrenches and other tools tapping rails, and low staccato shouts in Faroese. We watched passengers riding forward in boats toss stones into the water, aiming just behind the whale's flukes. All of this was intended to keep the whales moving straight ahead. The pod dispersed as much as possible within the confined area in which it found itself. I should mention that this event was taking place in a village called Chutnavik. Chutnavik's beach is framed by rocky cliffs on both sides. Some whales turned sharply to the left or to the right in an effort to avoid beaching and raked their bellies against the sharp undersea rocks. A vested man gave a signal, and with a shout, whalers on the beach ran into the surf. Most were part of two-person teams carrying large metal hooks tied to stout ropes. When the first man reached the first whale, he raised the hook and drove it into the blowhole. Immediately, 6 or 7 other men, chest deep in the cold water, took hold of the rope and began hauling the whale, still very much alive, and fighting the whole way toward the beach. When the whale's head rested on the sand, a man withdrew a knife from a wooden sheath around his waist and sawed into its flesh. The blood came immediately, great spurts, truly thicker than water, as the whale went into its final spasm, the knife having just severed its spinal cord. The process was both quick and complex. The whale thrashed its fluke, revealing its true size. Its blood soon mingled with the blood of other whales simultaneously being killed. The seawater turned red. As each whale died, men hauled its carcass further up onto the beach and then turned, dispersed, and joined other teams, either hauling or killing whales. The process was methodical, and after the whalers' initial shouts as they entered the water, quieter than I would have expected. I want to apologize for the graphic nature of the images, but I know of no other way to discuss whaling than to show what it's really like. It is a bloody job. It was a bloody job when they were doing it from Nantucket. It's a bloody job as they're doing it on the beach of Chutnavik today. I want to turn to the Caribbean briefly. And then we'll talk a little bit about the history of whaling, specifically in the Caribbean because of the local connection to Nantucket and to greater New England. And then we'll talk about some of the current research that I'm engaged in now. After having taken the historical ethnographic background that I spent years putting together, I've identified several pertinent research questions that we're addressing now, which may end up spelling out the end of whaling in one or both of these locations. But first, to the Caribbean. You may notice the boats in front of you on the screen look a little bit like the boat behind me. Maybe take off the outboard motor, add space for a few more rowers. You could see that it might be of the same design. That's intentional. There's a reason for that. I'll read another short passage here. Beginning in the early 18th century, ships based mainly in New England began visiting the islands of the Lesser Antilles in search of whales. After 1870, with catches declining, American seamen increasingly began to turn down positions aboard Caribbean-bound whaling ships, owing to the reduced profitability of the voyages. Captains filled their vacancies by hiring local men, quote, half-castes from all parts of the West Indies, end quote, in the words of one early 20th century economist. These Caribbean whalers accepted lower pay than their New England counterparts, which helped offset the losses of increasingly unproductive voyages. Basically what was happening was the Yankee whalers, as they were called, were finding fewer and fewer whales in the Caribbean, most likely because they were overhunting them, couldn't afford to pay the American whalers the price they demanded, the salary they demanded, so they would go and take on local labor from the Caribbean. When their employment with the Yankee whalers ended, some sought ways to continue putting their newfound skills to work. The rise in locally run whaling operations coincided with the continued decline and eventual collapse of American whaling in the Caribbean. Over time, Caribbean whaling came to be dominated by local labor and management. So we, if I can use the collective, we taught them how to whale. We, our ancestors, went down to the Caribbean, took these men on board, taught them the skills they needed. At the end of a voyage, at the end of a season, would drop them off, hopefully on the same island where they picked them up from, with nothing much to show except a paltry salary and a newfound skill set. These local newfound whalers were industrious. They started up shore-based whaling operations from their home islands. At one point, there were more than a dozen locally run whaling operations in the Caribbean, in the region immediately around St. Vincent. Those have slowly ended over the past century or so, but the operation based in St. Vincent, where I work, is a direct descendant of those original Yankee whalers that came down to the Caribbean. I try to remember this because it helps me put into perspective the anti-whaling message that is the most common discourse coming out of New England and the rest of the United States today. Yes, it's true that times have changed. Culture shifts, our approach to wildlife changes, ecology changes, the number of whales changes. But with a historical connection to whaling that's tied directly here in New England, the Caribbean whalers are, or should be, given a bit of grace, I believe, in terms of our calls to end what they do now. What I'd like to do is read a section that will describe whaling in the Caribbean as I witnessed it. And I'll preface this by saying that my involvement in Caribbean whaling was much more hands-on and long-term than my involvement with Faroese whaling. In the Faroe Islands, you never plan to go whaling. You go about your business doing whatever you're doing on shore or at sea, and when whales are sighted, you drop what you're doing, get to the boats, and drive them into the beach. It's a spontaneous activity. There are no professional whalers. Everyone's doing something else, and then they go whaling when the time presents itself. The Caribbean's different. There are professional whalers and whale processors and whale vendors. I count a little over 100 people directly employed by the whaling business in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and they go out most every day. The captain that I ended up working with, which is the man at the harpoon in the foreground of this image, goes out 6 days a week, 11 months out of the year. He normally takes a month off for boat repairs and some other business on shore. When I met this man, his name is Samuel, I asked him if I could go aboard his boat. He told me that he needed me to be reliable, that he needed me to avoid getting seasick. I did not fulfill that obligation. He needed me to be sturdy and strong and able to haul the ropes that the whales would be attached to. He needed me to contribute to the operation, not just to be a passive passenger on board the boat. This caused me to confront the reality of whaling firsthand because I was about to be doing it. After giving it some thought, after negotiating with Samuel on the terms, which were, by the way, that I would work for food, not for pay, we would troll a fishing line behind the boat, and when we took a mahi or a tuna, sometimes I would take it home with me for my dinners until it ran out. I signed on. I became a crewman on the whaling boat. In fact, I took this image from my position on the boat in the center row. The boat in the background gives you a better picture of what a crude Vincentian whaling boat looks like. There are 3 crew members. There's the harpooner in the front, the stern man in the back. He's the one that steers the boat. The harpooner is the captain. He calls the directions for the sternman to steer, and of course launches the harpoons. And then there's the centerman in the middle. This is the least skilled position. That's right. I am the least skilled member of the whaling boat. And the job here is mostly to pass items back and forth between the front of the boat and the back of the boat, to relay messages when necessary, and I would soon find out to cut the harpoons out of the whales or dolphins that have been harpooned, straighten them with a mallet on the gunwale of the boat, and hand them back to the harpooner for the next shot. Some of these bent harpoons behind me are bringing back strong memories of that job. In a bobbing boat, maybe at high speed, pursuing a pod of whales and dolphins, when a straight harpoon is needed pronto, I'm there whacking it with a sledgehammer, trying to get it into a straight enough position to hold true as it's shot or thrown at the whale. I'll read a passage here, and then we'll move into some of the current research questions. A solitary dorsal fin broke the water. This dolphin was our target. With a quick series of hand signals that I would later learn to interpret, Samuel silently instructed the sternman to position the vessel exactly as he wanted it. He readied the harpoon gun. The first harpoon had been loaded in the barrel since before casting off from the dock that morning, but Samuel took a few seconds to clear the area around his feet. The boat was bobbing on the waves. The engine was idling, and the dolphin was rising every 10 seconds or so. It would take a few cycles of bobbing and breathing before the boat and the dolphin were aligned. The moment this happened, Samuel squeezed the trigger, letting fly the projectile like a comet, followed by a tail of nylon twine and surrounded by a cloud of blasted gunpowder. I was expecting a pop, but still the sound startled me. Almost instantly, there was a splash about 30 meters from the bow, followed by furious splashing. The line pulled tight. The harpoon was secure. The dolphin beat against the, we hauled the dolphin in then. We grabbed the rope, the line with our hands, hauled it in hand over hand. It's still alive. As you know from touring the museum, a harpoon is usually not an instrument of death. It usually does not kill the animal. It simply attaches the animal to the boat. So we're hauling in a living dolphin, which of course is doing everything it can to swim away from the boat and from the source of its agony. The dolphin beat against the boat's hull with its tail. Fearing that the harpoon might tear out, Samuel raised another harpoon above his head and drove it in for added security. The animal stopped fighting. The second harpoon had killed or gravely wounded the dolphin, and it was time to haul it on board. In a coordinated effort, the three of us put our feet against the gunwale, took hold of the rope as near to the harpoon as we could, leaned back, pushing with our legs. The tail came up first. Samuel grabbed it and we leveraged the dolphin up into the boat. I slipped and landed face to face with its lifeless, toothy grin. We'd gotten one. This was actually the first dolphin I saw killed. Despite the fact that I had been working in the Faroe Islands for a few years, I had never been there for one of their whaling events. Remember, they're spontaneous. And I began working in the Caribbean simultaneously, went on this whaling voyage and watched this happen in front of me. This was difficult for me. And I think some of the reason that I have these images to show you is that I may have been hiding behind my lens a bit. I was still not sure that I could take what I was about to watch. I don't know what it says about me, but over time I grew accustomed to it. I hardened, perhaps, but it became something that I was used to seeing, and I don't like that about myself. But I came to help with the hauling and the harpooning and the cutting of these animals, and it became like any other job. And I wondered what that was doing to me on the inside. I'll read a little bit about the reflections that I wrote the night after watching this dolphin killed. I should mention that the name of the town where we were based out of was called Barrowley, and I'll mention that here in this reading. We motored back to Barrowley as I scooped seawater with my hand to wash my skin, my clothes, my bag. Everything was covered in blood. I rode back to my lodgings in a crowded public van, took a long shower to try to wash the scent and memory off my skin, and went to sleep that night with conflicting feelings. I knew that Samuel and his crew had provided food for their community and income for their households, but I mourned the dolphin's death. The dolphin then was brought ashore and processed into food. This is an image of its blubber, which had been cubed, being cooked over a fire. The fire is stoked with whale oil, so the oil then ended up fueling the fire that would extrude the rest of the oil. It's a very circular process that they use, very much like the old days of Yankee whaling, where the unusable parts of the whale would actually be fed into the boilers to boil the blubber and produce the oil. Here, though, it's not an industrial commodity or for lighting or lubrication or anything like that. The oil is a medicine. The blubber and the meat are food. So these are distributed among the community, sold at a very cheap price, cheaper than almost any other animal-based food product on the island, and accessible then to the most poor of the island's community. I'm going to turn off the images for now, and I want to shift a bit from the ethnographical description of whaling to some of the issues that have arisen during the time that I've been working. Now, of course, I approached this project as I would imagine most of you would, with concern for questions of conservation and animal welfare at the forefront of my investigation. I wanted to know what impact whaling was having on whale populations and on individual cetaceans. Rather early in the process, though, my attention became fixed on the human cost of whaling, especially given the fact that these are food commodities being produced from this activity. And I'll explain through some reading here. Poets refer to the ocean as mercurial. As an aside, I believe Shakespeare was one of those poets that used the word mercurial to refer to the sea. This word is used to emphasize the sea's volatile, temperamental nature, its unpredictability. But the word has another, more literal meaning, and that is simply containing the element mercury. Your thermometer, if it's antique enough, is a mercurial thermometer. While the mercurial, unpredictable sea has brought times of abundance and times of dearth to the whaling communities of St. Vincent and the Faroe Islands, the mercurial, mercury-laden sea may prove to be a threat that neither whaling operation can overcome. In the Faroe Islands, the contaminant issue is well known. In St. Vincent, the problem is just beginning to be understood. So some background here on the mercury issue. In 1977, the year that I was born, Faroese scientists had a hypothesis that maybe the meat, and to a lesser extent the blubber, that they were taking from these whales might be contaminated with a variety of environmental contaminants, but the most pressing and the most concerning was mercury. They started doing some tests, both on the tissue taken from the whales and on the humans that were consuming them, and found elevated levels of mercury. This initiated a long-term research project, which started in 1978, the following year, and is still going on today. I was meeting with some public health scientists up in Boston just last week who are engaged with this project. It's very much an ongoing thing. They're measuring the effects of mercury through the vector of whale meat into the human population in the Faroe Islands. Over the years, after 1978, after this initial discovery of the problem, the Faroese health authorities began issuing stricter and stricter dietary recommendations. At first, they just said, don't eat it if you're pregnant. Then they started saying things like, cut back on consumption no matter who you are. Male, female, pregnant, not. Just don't have it more than once every few weeks or so. These recommendations got more and more strict until it was said that if you are a female, you should not consume it until you've gone through menopause. The risk being that even if you did not plan to get pregnant, if you did get pregnant, all of those accumulated toxins in your body could pass on to the fetus and onto your child. Men were, of course, allowed to continue eating, although men did see some health effects in their own experience, not just in their offspring. I'll pick up the reading here with the most dire of these health recommendations that came out in 2008. Finally, in 2008, citing data that, quote, pilot whales today contain contaminants to a degree that neither meat nor blubber would comply with current limits for acceptable concentrations, end quote, the Faroese health authorities issued the landmark recommendation that, and this is a quote, and I want you to listen to how strict and stark this quote is. The pilot whale is no longer used for human consumption, period. Consider the gravity of that recommendation. The advice of the Faroe Islands' top medical researchers was to discontinue the consumption of meat and blubber from pilot whales, not to limit consumption, to stop it. They were not ignorant of what they were saying. Without consumption of the food products that it produces, whaling becomes meaningless, unjustifiable. In 2008, the Faroe Islands health authorities officially advocated ending the Faroe Islands' 1,000-year history of whaling. It's thought that the Vikings who first settled the Faroe Islands brought the tradition of whaling over with them in the 10th century. This tradition continued for years. In the 15th century, the Faroese started keeping records of every whale killed on their shores, and that record keeping continues to the present day. We have almost 500 years of continuous whaling records from the Faroe Islands. And this is a history that goes back possibly another 500 years into the deep past. But because of the present state of the marine environment, the health authorities, which would be the equivalent of our Surgeon General, for example, are saying that this should stop. It didn't stop. It continued, but with quite a bit more of a problematic nature than was seen before. This was a food product that was viewed as healthy. Before mercury was discovered as being a problem, doctors would recommend that children be given more meat and blubber from whales if they were maybe not thriving as they should. How quickly things turned. This healthy food became unhealthy in the span of one generation. It's been difficult for the Faroese to comply with these recommendations, but data show that they are attempting to. I wondered what was happening in St. Vincent. Nobody was there doing this research. There was no one on the year that I was born who even thought about this as a problem, and yet whaling had been happening and people were consuming the meat and the blubber at a pace and at a scale equivalent to that in the Faroe Islands. So I started my own investigation. I'll pick up the reading here. St. Vincent is at least 4 decades behind the Faroe Islands in its understanding of the public health risks presented by environmental contaminants in the whale meat. Together with scientific colleagues based in the United States and in the Caribbean, I've been engaged in the analysis of tissue samples collected from the edible parts of pilot whales and other dolphins brought ashore at Barely for the past few years. We have found levels of mercury higher than those found in the Faroe Islands at the beginning of the mercury study there. And I should pull back the curtain a bit and show you or tell you, because you took the trouble to come out here, exactly how much higher I'm talking about. In the book, I leave it at that. I just say higher. This isn't a scientific treatise. Some of my peer-reviewed journal articles do go into the quantitative nature of the data. Here's what I'll tell you. The World Health Organization says 1 part per million of mercury is the limit. So parts per million are the unit that we use. 1 part per million, 1.0. If it's higher than that, don't eat it. If it's below that, depending on how far from that limit, maybe consider eating it frequently or not so frequently. But 1.0 is the limit. In the 1970s, when the Faroese first realized that this could be a public health crisis, they were detecting levels on average at 1.5 parts per million. So 50% higher than what the World Health Organization says is too much. Our most recent data set from St. Vincent and the Grenadines showed an average of 77 parts per million. 1.0 is what the World Health Organization says is too much. They're consuming 77. That's an average. I have 1 piece of liver from a killer whale that had 3,000 parts per million in it. I regret that I only took a cubic centimeter for my sample and left the rest of it to enter the food supply. Somebody ate the rest of that liver, and I can't even imagine what their health status is like today. What does this mean? What are some of the implications for us? We live here, most of us in the United States. We do not hunt whales or consume whales. Most of us will not visit these places. We won't participate in whaling in either location. How does this tie into us? I'll read my final section here, and then I'll be happy to join a more informal discussion. The Faroese and Vincentians who are aware of and concerned about the presence of pollution in their food supply can and do speak out critically to the industrialized nations responsible for the pollution. I'll point out that mercury is mainly a byproduct of industrial processes that do not exist in the Faroe Islands or St. Vincent. Coal-fired power plants are one of the main sources of this kind of pollution. Neither country has a coal-fired power plant. By and large, almost entirely, this is a pollutant that is being brought in by wind and ocean currents from abroad. It may seem ironic for whalers to criticize the environmentally destructive behavior of non-whalers. Maybe, rather than merely noting the irony, anti-whaling activists should consider what it means that the environmental effects of their own country's actions are being called into question by small island whalers and whale eaters. Maybe this is a reminder that we should all consider the long-distance and long-term environmental effects of our lifestyles. This is where my project has brought me. I want to continue working with the whaling communities to perhaps craft dietary guidelines in the Caribbean, similar to what they have in the Faroe Islands. But I really don't see this as being a problem that can be solved by reducing the amount of whale meat or blubber that is consumed. With mercury levels as high as they are, I see this health threat as being the most likely cause for the end of whaling in the Caribbean. Although it hasn't ended yet in the Faroe Islands, so we may have quite a bit of time to pass before we see this happen. In addition to merely measuring the contamination and passing on information about it to the consumers of these contaminated food products, I'm interested to trace the contaminants back to their source. I'm working with scholars from a variety of disciplines to fingerprint mercury. This hasn't been done before, but we're trying to come up with a method that will allow us to tell where a molecule of methyl mercury came from originally. Did it come from a coal-fired power plant here in this country? Did it come from one in the European Union, in China and India? Or, like some mercury that exists in the global marine environment, did it come naturally from the Earth's crust? If it's natural, then that's just nature. If it's from humans, and if we can tell who those humans are, then we might have some tool to use in the pursuit of justice. Because yes, we want justice for the whales themselves. We want humane treatment of whales. We want all of nature to be able to live in harmony with humans, which are also a part of nature. But until that ideal happens, if we can find justice in between people, justice between communities and maybe even countries, then that will move us a little bit further toward our goal of a place where humans and humans live in harmony, and perhaps that will show us a way that humans and nature can as well. Thank you very much for your attention. I'd be happy to take any questions that anyone has. And I believe there's a microphone that will be passed.
Thank you. Professor?
Yes, sir.
Methyl mercury and mercury, elemental mercury are potent neurotoxins. Have you seen any symptoms of neurotoxicity in the Faroese or Mercury?
Thank you. Excellent question. The Faroese have a very robust healthcare system. As I said, they're a dependency of Denmark. This is a socialized Scandinavian country. Everyone in the Faroe Islands has a doctor that they can go see, and their health records are very well kept. So yes, there have been measured effects of mercury toxicity on Faroese people, and that does correlate with the amount of whale tissue that is consumed either by them or was consumed by their mothers while they were pregnant with the children. St. Vincent is a different story. It's a developing country with a lot of poverty. There are essentially two healthcare systems that run parallel to each other that exist in St. Vincent. At the upper level, the more economically privileged people, when they are sick, they buy a plane ticket. They might fly to Barbados, which is the next island over. They might fly to London, Toronto, New York, or Miami, and they see a doctor there. What that means is their health records stay there. The lower half, those that are on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, when they get sick, they take a spoonful of whale oil as their medicine, or they ask for something that's growing in the garden behind their house. There's very few people that live in that middle range that are seeing local doctors in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So we don't have the records that we need. Now, yes, I could go to London and mine through the NHS archives. I could go to Toronto and go through the archives of whatever the program is called in Canada. I could visit doctors in the US, but it's a disparate record. It's not all in one place like we have in the Faroe Islands. Now, anecdotally, yes, there are neurological issues in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There are developmental disabilities, learning disabilities, a lower than should be expected life expectancy, incidence of cancer and Parkinson's, which are also tied into mercury toxicity, but we don't have the quantitative data that we need to draw a correlation. We have anecdotes. One of my missions, one of my future research goals, is to form something of a Doctors Without Borders type effort to go into the villages, to offer free medical screenings to the people, and to take some biometric information from them on maybe the level of mercury in their hair, or their blood, or their fingernails, and to take some dietary records from them as well. Is this something that you consume regularly? If so, how often, how much? Only then can we begin to draw the line directly in St. Vincent. But human physiology being what it is, a Faroese person is no different from a Vincentian person in terms of their uptake and their reaction to mercury toxicity. I would expect to find the same problem, if not elevated, given the elevated level of mercury in the Caribbean. Yes, sir.
Do we know what effect the mercury is having on the whales themselves? The numbers are so high, one would expect to see the whale population begin to fall as a result.
Excellent question, and this is a hard question to get at. When a whale dies, it's very difficult to tell what the source of death was, right? This is something that has plagued marine mammal scientists for a long time. You find whales washed up dead on shore or washed up alive on shore, and it's hard to tell why they did that, right? You can measure the mercury in a whale, but you can't necessarily tell that the mercury level was the cause of that stranding. And if a whale dies at sea and sinks or decomposes, then it becomes even more difficult. This isn't a cop-out. There are some marine biologists who are pursuing that question directly, but their publications are maybe 1 for every 10 that deal with the issue in terms of human health. We are anthropocentric people. We care about our own. Given limited resources, we are going to pursue issues that directly relate to humans first. I suspect, though, that mammal physiology being what it is, a pilot whale would respond to mercury toxicity in a similar, if not exactly the same way, as you or I would. So yes, I expect that there are Caribbean cetaceans that are suffering and perhaps dying from this pollution.
Hi.
Yes.
You spoke earlier. Just to touch on that a little bit, with the invents of the seals, you have an unusual mortality event going on in New Hampshire, Maine, and in Massachusetts, which may shortly come back this way. And what they were finding in the early necropsies was that the animals had very heavy body loads of chemicals, and I'm not sure exactly which chemicals they were, or if there were heavy metals involved. But there was certainly enough chemical load to affect their immune systems. And the animals are carrying 2 viruses that are proving mortal. An avian flu virus, and more importantly, a distemper virus. And in maybe 2 months, under 2 months, we've had well over 1,000 animals die in Maine alone. And it could well be that there is an impact on their immune system compromised because of these human-induced chemicals. I want to ask you, how many cetaceans are the Grenadines taking annually?
So the number taken in each place per year? In the Faroe Islands, it averages between 850 and 900 on most years. What that means is about 6 whaling events, 6 of those drives, and then you can imagine that that number would be spread throughout. The drive that I read about only took 50 whales. Only took 50 whales. That was very small. The largest on record took 1,200. 1,200 whales driven into the shore. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, they take fewer per year. The average is, I believe, about 350 individual animals each year. And this is because they're harpooning them one by one, right? They're not driving them en masse. During each day of whaling, we would normally take a break, at midday to eat lunch and relax a bit. And during this time, Samuel, the harpooner, would pepper me with questions about the Faroe Islands. He had never been there, but of course, as a professional whaler, he was very interested to learn about other whaling communities. And he asked me one time to teach him how to drive whales ashore, and I refused. I was aided by the fact that you do need a specific type of coastline in order to get the whales ashore, and St. Vincent really doesn't have that kind of coastline. But even if it had, I don't think that I want to go down on record as the one who imported Faroese whaling into St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Hi.
Yes.
On the topic of eating cetaceans, is the meat prepared in a traditional style, or are there similarities between the 2 cultures? And you mentioned you had sampled some yourself, and what was that like?
Let's take meat first, and then if you don't mind, I can read an unplanned section of the book about the blubber. The meat it's a red meat. Dolphins and whales are mammals. They have red meat. I know this is probably common knowledge, but it is expected sometimes that it's going to look like fish. But it's not. It's a very lean red meat. In both places, they dry the meat to preserve it. In St. Vincent, where it's tropical and sunny, they'll hang it in the sun. In the Faroe Islands, where it's windy and cloudy, they'll put it inside these little houses with gaps in the walls, or little sheds. They're not houses. These little sheds that allow the wind to blow through, and the wind actually dries the meat. In St. Vincent, they normally rehydrate it before eating it. This tends to make it more palatable, more chewable, and actually it reduces the mercury concentration by weight. Right? If the water has evaporated off, then the mercury is even higher concentrated. But if you add more water back, you counterbalance some of that mercury. In the Faroe Islands, they eat it in its dried kind of beef jerky-like consistency. The meat, it tastes a bit like beef. It's got a kind of a fishy flavor to it. If you've ever cooked with fish sauce, like if you've cooked a Chinese dish, you add fish sauce to some, imagine cooking beef with fish sauce. That's a bit like the taste of meat, although it's really susceptible to whatever you cook it with. In the Faroes, they often use onions. It takes on the oniony taste. The meat is not that different from other meats that I've had. Let me read for you, though, a section, and then I'll ask you to bear with me as I find it, because I had not planned to read this part. Okay, so here's a section on the taste of blubber. The best way that I have found to describe the flavor and texture of whale blubber is this. Imagine you put on a pair of knee-high rubber boots and stomp on a pile of fish that has been pulled from the sea and left in the sun for 3 days or so. All right, so you got this image in your mind, right? You're wearing your waders or your Wellingtons, and you're stomping on a pile of 3-day-old fish. You step on the fish, you twist to grind your feet into them, you dance. The pile is deep. Think of making wine the old-fashioned way, except instead of stomping grapes, you stomp fish. You would never want to drink a glass of the liquid that is pressed out from this exercise. To get an idea of what it's like to eat blubber, both the flavor and the texture, after the fish have been thoroughly pulverized, stop stomping and eat your boots. When you try to chew whale blubber, your molars are ineffective. They do nothing. The consistency stays the same. It does not break into smaller pieces inside your mouth. What it does do is it extrudes its oil to coat the inside of your mouth and your tongue. You're at war with this morsel in your mouth. You're trying to chew it up and swallow it. It's not complying with you. This would ordinarily not be a problem because who has to eat whale blubber, right? It's by choice, except when you're a whaling researcher. I was faced with this, what I call in the book, the ordeal of the blubber, multiple times in my fieldwork. I would approach a person, or more often a group of people, and begin asking questions about whaling, and I would be presented with a piece of blubber and told, eat this. Before I'll talk to you, eat this. I saw this as a test of loyalty. I saw it as a test of my character. Was I actually who I said I was, that is, a supposedly impartial whaling researcher? Or was I maybe a Greenpeace or Sea Shepherd activist in disguise, right? Trying to get some intel. The assumption I assumed was that a pure-hearted scientific researcher would consume it out of solidarity with the local people, and that a spy would not. So I ate the blubber. And I was presented with this over and over and over again. And it wasn't just some Faroe Islands network that passed on the word, this guy's gullible, give him some blubber. This happened in St. Vincent. It happened in St. Lucia. I went to do interviews in Newfoundland among the former whalers there that had whaled back before it was outlawed by the Canadian government in 1972. They didn't have any whale blubber to give me. They gave me seal. Eat this, and then we'll talk with you about whaling. It was a challenge that I reluctantly had to accept. I'm glad that I paid my dues at a time before I knew the contaminant loads in these foods that I would be consuming. While blubber doesn't tend to hold on to mercury, it's a substance that adheres more to muscle tissue and organs than to fat. There's a whole other suite of contaminants that are attracted to the blubber. I know now what I was consuming, and thankfully I was just blissfully ignorant at the time. Yes, sir.
Has anyone done any research like you've done with the Icelandic and Japanese?
Oh, good question. Yeah, so the Japanese and Icelandic whalers are whaling commercially. The Japanese will tell you that they are whaling for scientific purposes. Don't believe it. It's a commercial whaling operation. There have been this sort of ethnographic, environmental historian type research project happening in those places. It's a bit more difficult, though, because of the institutionalization of whaling in both of those locations, Japan and Iceland. In the Faroe Islands and St. Vincent, whaling is done, well, in the Faroe Islands, it's done with completely a lack of institutionalization. Anyone can be a whaler. You show up on the scene, you're a strong body, you're there pressed into labor. In St. Vincent, it's a bit more of a profession, but it's not anything like you would see with the whaling society in Iceland or the government-sponsored whaling operation in Japan. So I kind of lucked out in choosing places that are whaling in more of an artisanal way. If I had opted to do research in Japan or Iceland or Norway, which is another one doing commercial whaling, I might not have had the same entrance that I do. Those projects exist. The literature has been very instructive to me in my own work, and I'm just happy that I work where I do. Yes, sir.
In the Faroe, it has been said that the anti-whaling movement actually don't kind of, for a matter of identity, kind of encourage the local to embrace whaling and even encourage local that wouldn't have whale to whale. You get my point, right? What do you think about that argument? I never really thought what to think about it.
No, it's an excellent point. So he's speaking of these anti-whaling movements, and in the Faroe Islands, it's led by the organization called Sea Shepherd, which I have to say does a lot of amazing and very much needed environmental work around the world. Sea Shepherd is at the forefront of many of the crises that we see in the ocean today. Its director, Paul Watson, is a passionate conservationist. He's also a very nice guy. I interviewed him for this book. He's got a really good heart on him. I do feel, however, like you alluded to, that the organization's work in the Faroe Islands is not accomplishing its stated goals. And I have some data to support this. So you'll recall in 2008, the Faroese health authorities issued this last or most stark recommendation to stop eating whale meat and blubber. I was there in 2009, the year after this, and I took some surveys on dietary habits. How much of this are you eating? And specifically, did you reduce your consumption after that recommendation was made? We found a 20% decrease in consumption in direct response to that health authority recommendation. Okay, so it's working. The recommendation is having the effect of people eating less whale meat and blubber. Paul Watson and Sea Shepherd began their operation against whaling in the Faroe Islands in 2010. So you've got the recommendation in 08, my survey in 09, which showed a decrease, Sea Shepherd on the scene in 2010, consumption has gone back up. The way that I explain this is that it is a source of solidarity among the Faroese. They've got a voice coming in from outside saying, don't do this, and the voice is not just saying, don't do this, please, right? This is saying, don't do this because you are fools. Don't do this because you have no common sense. Don't do this because you're a bunch of barbarians, right? And their reaction is maybe what our reaction would be. It's to coalesce what used to be a spectrum of support or lack of support for whaling into one solid, monolithic movement of Faroese nationalism. And to say, we are Faroese, we've been whaling for 1,000 years, a foreigner is coming in here telling us to stop, putting it on a mini-series on Animal Planet, we're going to do it even more. I know people who stopped eating whale meat after the health recommendations came out and started eating it again to assert their Faroese identity afterwards. So in that sense, I think your hunch is probably exactly right, that the anti-whaling movements, as I think pure intentioned as they were, have had the unintended consequence of actually increasing, if not whaling, at least whale meat consumption, which of course, based on supply and demand, is directly tied to whaling.
Just picking up on that point, it's the same thing with most nations. Certainly in Japan, organizations are trying to let Japan do their thing, while organizations like Sea Shepherd are trying to impose upon them. Maybe there's a balance and there's somewhat affects change. But in Iceland, there's been an internal movement that for the first time in modern history at least, I've seen 51% of the Icelandic people saying, man, we don't want to whale anymore. And what's driving the small whale whaling, minke whale whaling in Iceland is tourism.
Yeah.
And most of those tourists are from America. And they go to restaurants to try the culturally identified whale meat. So we've got to take that on our shoulders. I think that Iceland will, I hope that Iceland will relatively soon change their attitudes. There's only one wealthy man who is driving the fin whale industry, and he's currently sailing a ship to Japan over the northern part of Canada. And because of the lack of sea ice, they're able to do that.
Yeah, you're exactly right, and I would parallel that to my findings on the sources of mercury. That, you know, if you take a global average, and again, we can't thumbprint it yet, but if you take the global average of mercury emissions, they're coming from these industrialized countries like this one, and having this transnational effect. The same is true with tourism. I had a student last year to go to Iceland and do an internship with a whale watching organization. She would go out on the boat, and they wanted a native English speaker to do some of the scientific interpretation. And she did. You know, it was very conservation heavy. They were out viewing whales in their natural environment. She was talking about threats to whale populations, including the whaling that was happening just around the headland in another bay. And she related to me that after the voyage was over, it was a pretty common thing for a tourist to say, "That was amazing, that was great, thank you for your interpretation. Do you know where I could go to get a meal of whale meat now that I'm back on shore here in Reykjavik?" So yes, we do have an effect. And you know, each of us might think, I'm just one person, I'm just one tourist, it's just one meal, it was already killed, it was already prepared. But we have to think in the aggregate, right? Every time one of us does something, and so does 7 million others, it becomes a global phenomenon. That's where one person's actions or choice to abstain from those actions really can have an impact. All right.